to you for the work that you do. So wonderful to be here. I often say that I've never thought myself as a pioneer, but I was the youngest woman to be appointed as the government's chief nursing officer for England, the fourth woman to be ordained a bishop in the Church of England, and the first bishop of London to be a woman. I have to admit that I see myself as pretty ordinary, but in doing so, I recognise that I do give some baggage to my daughter. It hasn't passed me by that I was installed as in 2018 as the first Bishop of London, who was a woman, in the year that we marked 100 years after some women were given the vote, and in the week when 105 years before, a suffragette placed a bomb under the seat in which I was enthroned. Vergers were just as eagle-eyed then as they are now, and the bomb didn't go off. I have to say that I'm not naturally subversive, but I'm aware that as the first woman, as the Bishop of London, I am purely subversive by being a woman, and it is a necessity that I have sought to embrace. At my consecration as a bishop in 2015, it was on the feast of Mary Magdalene, and the former Bishop of Stepney, Bishop Adrian, preached and encouraged me to socialise and to subvert. He reminded us that Jesus chose outsiders, not so much to disturb the comfortable, but to disturb the conventional. And that it is through the disturbance of people like Mary Magdalene that we learn to see the world and God afresh. I recognise that because of who I am, not just because of my gender, my appointment here in London holds the opportunity to see the world, London, God and his church differently. I'm aware that often I just have to turn up and the world has changed. And the question that often sits in the back of my mind is, how do I use this disturbance for good? I want to start by sharing a little bit about the Church of England in London. It is a settled position of the Church of England that there are those who do not accept women as priests and therefore as bishops, and the Church has made provision for them. In London, there is possibly the highest concentration of these priests and these parishes, with something like 13% of priests and parishes not accepting me in my role as a bishop or as a priest because I am a woman. In the Church of England, we have had female priests only since 1994. And in 2015, the Reverend Livy Lane was consecrated and installed as the Bishop of Stockport, a suffragan or assistant bishop in the Diocese of Chester, and she became the first female bishop. 2019 marked 25 years since the first women were ordained. And in early 2020, a campaign organisation, Watch Women and the Church, reported that the number of women priests were slowly increasing. Some dioceses have reached what is arguably a tipping point, with around 1/3 of paid clergy being women. But others, including London, for lots of multiple interrelated reasons, were still hovering over around the 15% mark. So I'm very conscious of my responsibility of being a woman in this role. I am watched. People project onto me their expectations, which I'm certain I won't live up to. And I'm conscious that, as somebody has written, selfhood begins when I walk away from the expectation of others. For those of you that might have known my predecessor, Bishop Richard Charters, I am very different from him, which is a gift in one way, but people still say to me that I have big shoes to fill, that my voice needs to be deeper, that it must be hard for me not being as tall as him or even having a beard. And I remind myself that certainly at this age, I'm not going to grow any taller. I certainly hope never to grow a beard. And in a sense, I have my own shoes and my own voice. And I have to be faithful to who I am and who I believe God has called me to be. And maybe recently, maybe what's really important, I was recently reminded that it's not so important as the fact I have my own shoes, but rather what do I choose to do in them? And also, as Madeleine Albright once said, it took me quite a long time to develop a voice. Now that I have it, I'm not going to be silent. People have often commented that I've been successful in 2 careers or 2 professions, and I have to admit that I don't see myself as ambitious, but I've always sought to do the role that I'm given to my best of my ability, to take the opportunities that come my way. And I'm very conscious that I have a comprehensive school background. I went to a polytechnic. My ordination training was undertaken as part of a residential programme. There's no whiff of a private education or Oxbridge, and therefore I'm often seen as the outsider, even in the church as an outsider. But I certainly was an outsider in the Department of Health. I've often felt that those I have worked with didn't always get me, whether it was as a nurse or a senior civil servant, or in fact, as a priest. And also I couldn't always see people that looked like me. And in a sense, what I've come to realise is that we should have the confidence in who we are, in our differences. And if we can't see somebody that looks like us, maybe it's because there is an us-shaped hole awaiting to be filled. I also believe that even as women, we have to recognise our unconscious bias. Dame Mary Beard, in her book, Women and Power, says that when we think of a powerful person, we will still think of a white middle-class man. It may be my unconscious bias which is holding me back as well as others back. And I'm also reminded that when we find ourselves in places of power, we must not pull up the ladder. We need to be people who support those that come behind us, giving away our power, mentoring and coaching them. And the changes that we have seen will only be established if we encourage and give confidence to the next generation of women and to women right across the globe. Some may take the view that feminism has achieved its agenda, at least in the developed world. Gender equality is, after all, enshrined in key legislation in numerous ways. But I think you probably, with me, would recognise that globally, it's not quite as obvious as that. In 2017, the gender strategy of the non-governmental organisation Christian Aid cited that in many societies, even before birth, a boy is valued more than a girl child. The World Bank estimates that gender selective infanticide accounts for something like 1.56 million missing girls. At school, girls completing primary school and secondary school is still far below that of boys, and it's estimated that only 42% of girls with a disability complete primary education. And even when women do complete schooling, they are still likely to be paid less than men, hold jobs that are more insecure than men, and are far less likely to hold management positions. 1 in 3 girls will be affected by domestic abuse, most likely from an intimate partner. And I guess it was all of that where my contribution to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women 64 comes in. It was wonderful to be able to attend it this year, even though it was virtual. And what I hoped to do was to raise awareness of 5 ongoing areas of work that were related to the status of women. First of all, women's health. Secondly, modern day slavery. Thirdly, asylum seekers and refugees. Then women against violence. And finally, women in leadership. And whilst the UK government and NGOs and faith-based organisations are already collaborating on these issues, in a sense, there's a much further to go. And I was also very privileged to be able to give the sort of faith-based view at CSW 64. Faith communities are uniquely placed to know the lived experience of society's most vulnerable people, because it is often places of worship that are present in every locality. Historically, many activists for social and political change have been motivated by their religious faith. The concept of gender justice is rooted in the biblical vision that women and men are created in the image of God, made one in Christ, and called and equipped by the Holy Spirit to proclaim the good news of God's saving love, seeking first the righteousness and justice of the kingdom of God. Gender justice is for all people, for the health and well-being of individuals, for the church and for the world. Working for gender justice is an instrumental part of building healthy communities, interdependent relationships and communities. For me, it is a mission imperative that the Church of England should seek to transform its own structures as well as those of the society it serves. The Church can provide essential leadership on vital issues by working together to promote gender justice at every level and for everyone. As pointed out in the statement Faith in Beijing 25, a collective faith actors advocating for gender justice, 84% of the world's population identify as a member of a religious organisation. And faith-based organisations across the world often exist in communities where governments find or have great difficulty to engage and connect with individuals. So just now, a couple of reflections on some of those topics. Firstly, I want to turn to modern day slavery. There are at least 40 million victims of modern day slavery in the world today, and tens of thousands in the UK. It is really incredible that I live in London, one of the most wealthiest cities in the world, a capital heralded for its history and culture, and yet modern day slavery is thriving. Hundreds of people are trapped by domestic servitude, forced labour and sexual exploitation, all in plain sight of Londoners. And many more at risk of falling through the cracks, hidden from the views of authorities, charities and the church. And behind all those statistics are real people. And for me, it has been a privilege to visit a number of safe houses and projects such as Tamar here in London, which support women and to meet with individuals who are made in the image of God and hear their stories of what modern day slavery looks like. Therefore, a couple of years ago, the Diocese of London's Lent Appeal was focused around modern day slavery. We first of all wanted to encourage parishes to raise awareness of the issue and to equip people with the skills to spot the signs and then to know what actions they should take. And really it was this issue of making people aware that modern day slavery is hidden in plain sight. Secondly, we then went on to partner with 5 charities who were already working to end modern day slavery in London, that were dealing with the exploitation of women and young people who had been trafficked specifically for sexual exploitation, for forced labour and domestic servitude. We asked then all of our parishes to prayerfully consider how they could join together to raise funds, but also to support them in other practical ways. And after that a successful Lent campaign, we wanted to go on and develop the pastoral response of the churches here in London, so that those who were able to identify those as being caught up in modern day slavery would know how to respond. So now a number of churches in London have identified people in their congregation who are caught up in or susceptible to modern day slavery. And there are other churches who are beginning to reach out to sex workers and other particular vulnerable groups. And what is striking about churches is that many of our volunteers understood very little about the possibility of exploitation and how, in fact, even in the services that they provide could make other people vulnerable. So, because many of our churches run projects for those that are vulnerably housed, food bank, they provide refugee work, advice centres. And so therefore they're working with people who have a vulnerability, and all of those people are susceptible to exploitation, which could lead into modern day slavery. So we wanted to equip them to discern, but also to know what was best practice in a way that they could walk alongside people and support and help them. So we pulled together a number of key leaders and thinkers to form a steering group, and it included people who pastor, to people, it included professional trainers, it included those who are managing safe houses. And together, we hope that we can begin to address this huge problem. And despite COVID-19, the group has met, they've discerned a way forward. They've created an online training program, Hidden Voices, which is there for church groups wanting to be better equipped to volunteer in this area. And this type of community mobilization equips people to identify modern day slavery in their location and act on it. But the project is also exploring the possibility of identifying a church and a community that could become a centre of excellence, so they could train and support, particularly around modern day slavery in London. We hope it will become a place that becomes an expert in triaging victims, supporting them to understand the services available, and to help them to use services such as the National Referral Mechanism. We hope that they can provide advocacy so that their voices can be heard, but maybe most importantly, can provide the pastoral support that is so much needed in giving them confidence to take the next step. Alongside, I want to talk now a little bit about domestic abuse and support for refugees. Alongside other bishops in the House of Lords, I recently co-sponsored and spoke on 3 amendments to what is now the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. My amendments aim to highlight the importance of providing safe reporting pathways specifically for migrant women who are domestic abuse survivors. Secondly, to criminalise non-fatal strangulation and suffocation as an indicable offence. And thirdly, to remove the impediments on the path to justice when survivors seek evidence letters from healthcare professionals, in that they shouldn't be charged for that. I have also sought to bring pressure on the UK government to ratify the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention. This is a human rights treaty aiming at the prevention of violence against women, victim protection, and ending the impunity of perpetrators. In signing but not yet ratifying the convention, the UK government is not legally bound to implement the measures it says it supports. As I've already said, faith communities and networks are uniquely placed to engage with social issues on the ground, but we also have a responsibility to put things right. For example, in the church, where false theologies have been used to encourage women to maintain relationships with abusers, we have to speak out about that. A worshipping community or faith-based organisation which does not seek to embed gender justice in its structures and relationships, I believe is failing to live as a community that reflects God's glory in the world. It fails to live out God's grace as image and reflected in Jesus Christ, and thus we are failing to work for the kingdom of God. I've said quite a bit this morning, and I look forward to your questions. I have a real privilege meeting every day women across this wonderful city, and I'm humbled by their courage and tenacity. And I do not underestimate your ability to inspire others, to encourage others to act. And I will just end with some words from Amelia Earhart. The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Sarah. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for that amazing talk, which it was fantastic to hear the detail of what you've been doing in working with your churches on modern day slavery and your actions on domestic abuse. That's fantastic to hear, and it's I'm sure will give us some ideas. I'm sure we've got some great questions. If people can have a think, either put them into the chat or hold your hands up. But while we're doing that, Bishop Sarah, if I could just ask, of the other areas, COVID has obviously had a devastating effect. In your experience in London, what do you think are going to be the greatest challenges coming out of COVID, particularly for women and girls, but for life in general in London?
It was interesting. I read a book over the summer that was written in 1924, and it was written about the plague of 1665. And the similarities are phenomenal, not least the Lord Mayor then banned public meetings and public entertainments, and people were put into isolation. But one of the key themes in the book is that the plague, as with COVID-19, affected those that were least able to manage it, really. And London, both then and now, those that were rich exited London. I mean, London was probably quieter than Tiverton, actually, I think, during the pandemic, because people left. And who remained were the clergy, the doctors and the nurses and the poor. And so in London, a lot of the fault lines we just saw got bigger, so health inequalities, racial injustice. So you were more likely to get COVID, be hospitalized and die if you were in a lower social group, and you were less likely to have a vaccination. So some of those inequalities you just saw in the city. And so I think some of the challenges going on is that those least able to manage COVID were greatest affected. And whilst I'm amazed at people who managed to homeschool, and some people did it and did it wonderfully, others really struggled. And I visited a group when one of the lockdowns ended earlier in the year, and it was a secondary school in Tower Hamlets, and some of year sevens at that point, it was the first time they had access to computers and Wi-Fi. So they had gone through the majority of the pandemic without access to our IT technology. So you can imagine the impact that would have had on their schooling. Yeah. So I, in a sense, there are real legacies around those sort of inequalities. But I also think for all of us, we should not underestimate the impact that COVID will have had on our mental well-being and our physical well-being. And I suspect we will not know the full impact of that for some years to come. So there's a bit about us looking to the needs of others, but also recognising the impact on us personally for it.
Thank you, Sarah, Bishop Sarah. That definitely strikes a chord. I think I can see Barbara Beach's hand up. Barbara, have you got a question? No, you're looking at me strangely. No, that's all right. Forgive me. It's my pointer on that's confusing me. Have we got any questions, ladies? Ooh. Yes, Pauline. If you'd like to unmute yourself. Pauline, are you able to unmute yourself? Oop. Now I've lost her. No. Not to worry. Sorry, Jane, do you have a question?
Yes, Dame Sarah, what does a normal day or a normal week look like for you?
Oh my goodness, I don't think there is a normal, actually. I think if I ever had a routine, I wouldn't know what to do. Gosh, I don't know. I think one of the wonderful things is it's very varied. So, if I were to give this week as an example, so within this week, I've met some individual clergy, a number of them one-to-one for an hour to talk about how things are going. I've also, for example, this afternoon, I'm going to do a service in the cathedral for Christians Against Poverty. Last night, I was at a fundraiser for one of our churches in London, and we were wonderfully entertained by Jules Holland. So that was part of it. I was also, I was talking to some ministers about ministers, as in not the church, but MPs, about some of the work that's going around health inequalities. So it's it's very varied. So I could be out visiting a school next week. I'm out visiting a school next week. 10 days ago, I visited some of the Afghan refugees that are being put up in one of our London hotels. So it's a very varied week, really. And I think probably that's what, for me, that's what's great. That's the, yeah.
So within all that, how do you relax? How do you take care? It's World Mental Health Day coming up. How do you take care of your mental health?
Yeah. So I think probably say that I do it poorly. I own up to not getting it brilliantly well. There are some things. So one of the things in lockdown, in London, I'm in a house that's surrounded by office blocks, and we have a very small, what's called a patio garden. And at the beginning of lockdown, it had been less desolate from our builders. So in lockdown, in fact, what I did was I created a sort of, there's no grass and it's really overshadowed. So it's a sort of woodland garden that I created. So there's so for example, I spent half an hour just sitting out there this morning. So there's something about how you settle into the day. I also jog very badly, which I hate doing, but I'm told it's good for my mental health. And in fact, seeing Daphne on the call, one of the things I really missed during lockdown was the at Grand Western Canal, because that's where I used to jog with my dog. And of course, you could see the kingfisher. Seeing the kingfisher was such a regular occurrence. But of course, in lockdown, my jog was just within concrete. So it's so there are some things that I do that I know I do because it keeps me well. I hate jogging, but I do it because it keeps me well. And in fact, I also increase cycling as well. So there's some things that you think you actually need to do this to contribute to your health. So finding still places, a bit of jogging, a bit of cycling. And also the other thing I discovered, and I think we all have, is having been separated from our family and friends, actually the last period since, I suppose, July, is just catching up with family and friends. And, just food and laughter is so therapeutic, isn't it, really?
I think it's really, I hope the others have found it. It's really good to hear Dame Sarah about as normal as us. Although not in your working world, but in the way that it's finding time to be and to look after yourself, isn't it? Thank you very much.
I think Mary had her hand up.
Right. I wanted to ask you about the first thing that struck me when you spoke to us, Bishop Sarah, which was your concept of disturbance for good. And it struck me because the problem that we have as Soroptimists sometimes is that we are told that we mustn't be political. And I just wondered if you had a similar problem in your day-to-day work. I'll leave you to answer that.
Yeah. Well, you will, I suppose on a couple of levels, you will probably hear in the media sometimes the sense of which they say whether it's the Archbishop or bishops need to get out of politics. And I guess the first thing I'd say is that being a Christian, fundamentally being a Christian, there are things that we say that in a sense aren't political, but they are about justice. And they are about not just individual justice, but societal justice. So whilst I may not say I'm political, I recognise that maybe some of the things I stand for or speak out against or speak up for in the House of Lords will be perceived as being political. And I suppose what I would say is I'm not part of a political party, but we are part of the political system, and therefore it's important. So in that way, we do there is often a little bit of tension, but in a sense, I don't apologise for that, because actually I think I could very clearly argue that when I speak up for something that I feel I could demonstrate the theological rootedness in the Christian faith. But I do think the other part from being a woman, so I do think that's a very fine line, particularly in a church where there is this settled position, where there are those, I was with one last night, he does not think I'm a bishop. loves to use the word Dame, but wouldn't ever use the word bishop with my name. So therefore, I meet those. And so the challenge for me is, in a church that has that settled theological position of that difference, when is it discrimination and when is it theology? And when I behave, do people think I'm being political or I'm just being who I am as a woman? So that they aren't always easy things to play. And so I do. So I will call out misogyny, but that's quite hard, and therefore people may think I'm being a feminist, or I'm not. It's just unjust. And in a way, I don't mind the criticism, because actually, if I think I can demonstrate what it is, I will do it. But I think that for me is that there are some tensions around that, and I also think misogyny exists, and it exists in some parts more than others, and therefore how do you call it out in a way that is about bringing about change and not just about clashing with somebody? And I think probably that's one of my hardest challenges, is discerning the difference between sort of discrimination and what is a theological settled position, because bishops are a focus of unity. So although they may not think I'm a bishop, they do see me as the ordinary. So they'll see me as the Bishop of London in a sort of administrative sense, not in a priestly sacramental role.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pauline, did you?
I think I'm unmuted now, I hope.
Yes, you have succeeded. Well done.
Clumsy fingers this morning, sorry. So thank you very much, Bishop Sarah. Can I just ask you, we live in a very multicultural society at the moment, and a lot of the young women and girls during lockdown in particular have been put down by some of the men. And I've seen this with my own grandchildren, 2 granddaughters of teenage years. How are we going to encourage them to follow your example and take up the opportunities that are there for them, without making them become too brash and out there, but giving them support to move forward into a brave new world? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I've talked a bit about some of the gender issues, but of course the intersectionality that is even more critical is also the racial one as well, the racial injustice. And some of you will know more than others that when that intersection occurs, it becomes even harder. And so there is no doubt in my mind is we all have a role around encouraging and nurturing the value of individuals. And certainly in my role is for me to use the agency that I have to ensure that I encourage people from a whole range of different backgrounds, so the social backgrounds as well as racial backgrounds. And certainly in the church in London, we haven't got the answer yet, but we're beginning to learn from those who are better skilled than me to understand how we can do that. And part of that is for me to have an awareness of my own white supremacy. So I may be a woman, but I'm also white. So therefore, what is it what agency do I have to change the structures around me to enable that people to have good opportunities, but also to mentor people and to encourage them, and also fundamentally to recognise, if we want a church in London that represents our population, the church will automatically change because actually culturally there are differences. So how do you create a sense of sense of confidence in the church that it can change as much as confidence in the individual that it's able to be there? And certainly, certainly I have in a sense, I'm mentored both ways. I'm mentored by somebody who can help me with some of the cultural stuff I don't see, as well as I mentor people of different backgrounds to get on. So it's about saying, where is our agency? What can we do to give confidence? But also, where is our agency to change some of the structures that maybe don't promote a multiracial, intergenerational, multi-gender environment? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Bishop Sarah. Can I ask Jen, who has a question about your nursing background?
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Bishop Sarah. Nice to meet you. Yeah, my question was just about going back to your time as chief nurse. Were there any leadership lessons from that time that you've taken forward into your current role?
Yeah, so I'm very clear. I couldn't be the bishop I am today if it wasn't for the fact I was a nurse, as well as the government's chief nursing officer. So, as the government's chief nursing officer, although I had there was a line management role, I didn't manage nurses across the NHS. So at the time, there were 420,000 nurses. Now I didn't manage them; I led them. And so it's exactly the same as a bishop. I don't manage the clergy and the parishes of this diocese, but what I do is I lead them. So that there are huge similarities, in a sense, in how you operate a leadership role that is about influencing rather than directly managing. So I think that was the first thing. The second thing is that fundamentally, for me, it's always about people. So whether it was the NHS or whether it was the church, it's about caring for people. So there are huge commonalities, and the ability as a nurse to be with anybody really of any background, and how you are able to do that. So for me, that's given me great ability in the church, and because you can meet anybody, and in a sense I've got a good background about how then you communicate with them. The third one I smile at. I don't, there may be nurses or doctors on this Zoom room this morning, but I, as a nurse, and particularly as a ward sister, I learned how to deal with consultants. There is a way how you manage consultants, and lots of people are smiling there. There you go, who the nurses or the doctors are. So, which is a great skill. So as a ward sister, I knew how to manage my consultants, which is a great skill. When I came into government, I used exactly the same skills to manage the politicians, the ministers. And I've used exactly the same skills when I came in the church to manage bishops and archbishops. And that's my secret. and some of you will know. So there were some of those things that are just completely, comparable, really.
Thank you. That I relate to that. I work in human resources in the NHS.
Okay.
So you've got a very nice smile from me. Thank you.
That's lovely. I think, excuse me, I think Sushi has a question. Sushi, do you want
Yeah, it was just if you could tell us a little bit more about the online training regarding modern slavery and how the people in your church identify people who are potentially vulnerable to it.
Yeah, so it's if you want to go and look at some examples, I mean, the CLUR initiative is Google CLUR modern day slavery. You'll be able to go and see some of those resources that are available. We've done some other stuff slightly different in partnership with them. So what the training program does is help people to spot the signs. And it's striking, if you go to a church in some of our particular areas, you will, when they build up relationships with people, it's all relational. It's about those relational things and spotting some of the things that happen. So, for example, the way people answer doors, what's said in the playground when the nannies or the au pairs are out and about. So it's something about how you build relationships with people to spot that they may be in some sort of servitude relationship. So that's what it first of all does. But what's also very clear from these projects is you don't having spotted somebody, it isn't the issue of just then taking them out, because there's a whole, some people take them years to then make the decision to come out of that environment, because of course they're safe in one sense. They may be unsafe in another sense, but they're safe in it, whether it's their immigration status, whether it's the fact they've got roof over their heads, or they've got food, even if it's an abusive relationship. So what the the online stuff does is partly teach people around how you can tell the signs, but also what then would be good practice, what would be good and what would be wrong. So that's what the material does. And there are, and whilst it's all in plain sight, there are some churches in London who, for their geographic reasons, maybe would have more people vulnerable around them than others. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think we've just got time for one more question. Sylvia, would you like to ask yours?
Yes, you mentioned leadership, but one of the things I see in my working life still is that when we have young men applying for their first jobs, they're demanding straight away to go to the top job, you know, to the main person. But the girls still apply to be the assistants, and then they settle for being the assistants. And it seems to me that there's a lack of confidence still amongst young women. And if anything, actually, over the recent years, their confidence seems to have declined.
Yeah, and one of my observations, you know, I still talk, you know, I mentor a lot of women in the church, and I still say to them, you know, that actually in an interview, often if you're a man, you turn up in a suit and you've got, you know, your classes, you've possibly got the job. Whereas a woman, you have to turn up and prove yourself. You know, I still think there's some bias. And I also think that young women today see the injustice maybe more than we did. So therefore there is the bit about, you know, would I ever really get that? So I think there are a couple of things. The first one is with the young women is actually don't underestimate your ability to support and encourage young women to give them, to point out why they should have the confidence to get it, not just say it, but highlight to them where their good things are, and also just to help them to be able to articulate where those good things are. And I'm a great believer in either learning sets or getting people together in little groups that can encourage each other. So getting a group of young women together that can support each other, because actually there's some confidence and sharing of it, that they can nurture each other when they go for the job interview, or, you know, they can egg each other on. So there's something about that. The third one, I think, is the area about how do we challenge people and say, actually, you know, if you're looking for somebody to appoint, you need to sometimes have a wider perception of what you're looking for. So I still think, you know, people look for, as I said before, you know, Mary Beard says it, you know, we still think of power as being white and male. And so some of the work I do is I challenge, you know, it is not unheard of when people say, for example, you know, why are there few women leading big churches? And somebody will say, well, there just aren't good women. And I say, no, now tell me what you mean by good women. And so I begin to get them to break down that what they're looking for is maybe male. And so if you get to describe it, and I do think sometimes, I mean, you know, it depends on all of us. I mean, I would lead differently than any of you, really, probably. But it's trying to get them to recognise that sometimes, you know, good leadership may look slightly different. And I joke sometimes when I first came to London. There was, particularly at the cathedral, when they had a reception downstairs, they had a platform that you had to climb onto. It was great if you had trousers on, you know, but if you had a skirt on, well, it was a nightmare. And it was just just highlighting to them that what they were constructing was something male. And now I know lots of women do wear trousers and they wouldn't have had a problem. So, you know, but there's just something. So I think the three things: one is us personally mentoring and encourage young people. Secondly, about encouraging them to get into little groups, support groups that they can follow through. And thirdly, about us challenging some of our male colleagues or female colleagues to try and deconstruct things, to really understand what they're really looking for, and that they haven't just, and we and them haven't just said, you know, the ideal is a white man.
That's lovely. If I can hand over to Pauline, who's going to give our vote of thanks, please.
Okay, I hope I'm still on.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, Bishop Sarah. What an interesting and enlightening talk. You've uplifted us all, and it's great to see that you share so many of our values and tasks that we've set ourselves. We do need to challenge people. We need to challenge the status quo. We need to focus our energies on women and girls and go back to that, because that's what we're all about as Soroptimists, and not forget that in this world. And it's a strength that we've got, so we need to keep going. We also need to tackle our government about the Istanbul Agreement. I can't believe that we haven't actually signed that yet. I knew that we hadn't a little while ago, so we've got to do that. We've got to make sure that happens. I did smile when you spoke about managing consultants. I managed 6 of them. And it wasn't the easiest time of my life, but my goodness, didn't I learn a lot about managing people and dealing with things. So it's great. Thank you so much for sharing your morning with us. It's been really, as I say, really enlightening and great to meet you. And thank you very much on behalf of all of us. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you for all you do. Thank you. I should say goodbye then.
Can we just say a thank you in the traditional but silent way? It's been fantastic to have you with us, Bishop Sarah. Thank you very much for giving us your time and your insight. It's been fascinating and very enjoyable.
Well, thank you very much and have a good rest of the meeting.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.